here on Animal Activism Collective's channel. I am excited to be joined by two incredible guests today. First, I want to give a quick disclaimer. While AAC, Animal Activism Collective, supports the overall mission of animal liberation, our group was not involved in recent ALF actions, and we're simply reporting on it here with these two legendary guests that we have. I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Jerry Vlic. He's a longtime activist and press officer with the North American Animal Liberation Press Office, as well as Peter Young, who lived as a fugitive for the better part of a decade after liberating animals from fur farms. He's a former political prisoner, author of several books, including one of my favorite books of all time, Liberate: Stories and Lessons on Animal Liberation Above the Law. Um, so what we know so far is that 2,000 animals were liberated on the night of July 2nd, I believe. And what is believed to be Tonn's mink farm in Stark County, Ohio. Uh, Dr. Vlasic, what else can you tell us about what happened the other night?
Well, we don't know for sure. We have not received an anonymous communique from the activists that performed this action, although we often receive them several days later. But we know from reporting and from the Fur Commission USA themselves that somebody entered the farm, tore down some fences, and liberated approximately 2,000 mink into the wild. Of course, they're claiming that the animals are all going to die and freeze to death or starve to death sometime in the next 20 minutes or 48 hours or something. But we know that not to be true. These animals have gotten a chance at freedom, considering that 100% of them would have been killed sometime in the next month and skinned for their pelts.
So right now, just to recap, Jerry, correct me if I'm wrong. There's no communique. We just know that the Fur Commission has acknowledged there was a mink release. We don't know. We actually really aren't 100% certain about the exact farm because there's two farms in close proximity, but we're pretty sure, just kind of based on triangulating where what the farm is, and that's about all we know right now, right? 2,000 mink. And I think there was some details released about like the amount of fencing stripped away, but the details are pretty sparse right now.
Yeah, Ton's mink farm is the one that we suspect is the only one located in the town of Massillon, Ohio, which is where the reported break-in liberation occurred. There is one more farm that's within a few miles in a different town, but we suspect it is Ton's fur farm, which, by the way, was raided by the Animal Liberation Front on November 8th, 2022, and 1,000 mink were released from farm back in 2022.
So it makes sense. I mean, when you find a farm that, in terms of its layout and its location, lends itself to being raided, it's very tempting to to want to go back. And so, and there's not a lot of farms that fit that criteria. So it would make sense. It's the same farm, even though we don't know for 100% sure right now.
Peter, what would it take to pull off something like this? Like you've been to fur farms, you served time in prison for liberating animals. So can you tell us a little bit about, what it takes to pull something like this off, liberating 2,000 animals?
There's really not much to it. So the first thing you do is you start with the fur farm list, and you can go to filenail.com. There's printed versions out there, and you get a list of farms. And so from there, generally you usually, I mean, ideally you want to drive by one time in the daytime and one time at night, or do some, whether it's drive by or on foot, surveil it in the daytime and the night. Ideally, that's usually not an option. And it's usually, I wouldn't say it's always necessary, but there's certain things you can see in the daytime you can't see at night, obviously. But then also on the other side, you want to be able to get a good look at what the exact environment you're going to be in is like at night. But that amount of surveillance usually isn't exactly necessary. But once you get an idea about where you're going to park, and that could be on the property, that could be several miles away. You could walk in, you could bike in. There's all sorts of options, but you get an idea where you're going to park and the layout of the farm and kind of how you're going to approach it. And the next thing you want to do, and you usually don't have the opportunity to assess this before the actual action, but you would then want to assess the fence. The fence is where sometimes even more than half of the time dedicated to an action like this is going to go towards dismantling the fence, depending on how difficult the fence is to fell. So You're going to be looking at the fence. How are you going to dismantle it? So then, you show up night of, approach the farm, you assess the fence. You also want to look for security, which is becoming. I think that I don't know if there's any I know there's no hard stats on this, but it seems to be the industry is because as it's declining, it's becoming more desperate and they're giving more attention to security. Fur Commission is like openly right now recommending specific security systems to its farms, where historically it hasn't pushed that nearly as hard. So you want to assess, is there a security system in place? I've never seen a security system. I shouldn't say never, but most security systems I've seen have been fairly easy to circumvent. So that's not necessarily a hard stop if you encounter that, but then you assess the security system. And at that point, once you're in and the fence is cut, it's just a matter of opening cages at that point, and the animals will find themselves out. And the fence is really the key detail that's going to separate whether 1% of the animals get away versus a much bigger percentage. So I think there's a lot of work that has to be gone into dismantling as much of the fence as you can, and then it's just a matter of opening cages.
What are the financial implications of this? Like, if this is the fur farm that we think it is, it's already been rated with 1,000 animals approximately being liberated. I think it was what, just a couple of years ago or a few years ago. And now they've been rated again with 2,000 animals escaping this time. Is this fur farm going to be able to stay open?
I think it's important to remember that a lot of these fur farms have closed after the raids have occurred because it is expensive for them. And a lot of them may or may not have adequate insurance. And it also turns out that right now, with the fur farm industry being on the ropes, the price of pelts is so close to break even that a lot of these guys that maintain fur farms are looking for an excuse to get out of the business anyway. They're not making much money, if any. Peter mentioned increasing amounts of security. Well, that costs money. And so when you're barely breaking even anyway, and you're forced to be buying security cameras and trip lights and monitoring all that, it's enough to just push them over the limit and say, you know what, I'm not making any money. I'm going to quit doing this and go find right livelihood somewhere. So we'll hope that this one is the final push for this particular farm, assuming that's the one it is, and hopefully it'll be added to the list of fur farms that have closed. Most fur farms have closed in the last 10 years. We're down to almost certainly less than 100 fur farms in the United States right now, down from 300, I think, as recently as about 2014 or 15. Correct me if I'm wrong, Peter.
Yeah, that's about right. And I think, like you said, Jerry, it's these farms right now have no margins, right, and no profit margins, and so anything could be a death blow for a fur farm. So, for example, I think in a weird way, a raid could be the best thing that happens to a farm right now because they're like Jerry said, they're looking for a way out. And so if you get hit by activists, you get an insurance payout, and that could be really the best thing that's happened to you for a while because you haven't been paid in years. Since the industry started to decline, the pelt prices have plummeted. These farmers really haven't been able to pay themselves for quite a number of years. So, it might actually, in a weird way, be almost, I would say, it would be high likelihood it would be a death blow to the farm itself. But from the farmer's perspective, he hasn't been making money for a long time. He's probably looking for a way out. This could be a weird win-win for for the farmer and then for obviously for the
Exactly.
animals. So,
Are
but
there
yeah, I mean, look,
ever,
yeah.
I was going to say, are there ever situations where, fur farmers have like performed some kind of insurance fraud, like liberating the animals themselves, blaming it on activists so that they can basically get out of the game? Like, are there times where that has happened? And is that something that would almost make sense for fur farmers to do right now?
There was a raid a few years ago at I think it was called Lion Farms where they claimed that 40,000 mink were released into the wild. That was almost certainly a jillion percent exaggeration. I think they did that for the insurance purposes. I think in reality there might have been 2, 3, 4,000 animals released, but I don't think there's any way that 40,000 mink were released from a fur farm in a single evening. So I think there are some examples where people have definitely fudged the numbers. I think they tend to add numbers to what they think have been really released, and also the number that are recaptured. We know they always claim that they recaptured, 80% of the animals that were released. When we know for a fact that's just not true.
I can tell you for a fact with some of the situations I'm personally familiar with that the numbers are padded significantly. There was one instance I'm familiar with where they reversed the numbers the other way, where they cut the numbers down by about 60%, which is extremely confusing. I don't know what the motive would be for that, but yeah, they're highly motivated to skew the numbers, the estimates the other way in terms of over exaggerating the number of animals released. But Jerry mentioned the lion farms, so that was probably definitely insurance fraud. But there actually is a well documented case, or fairly well documented case of actual insurance fraud that happened in Minnesota back in 2017 or 16 ish, where I think it was a Lang farm. I believe it was Richmond, Minnesota, where the farmer claimed that overnight activists had released also 40,000 mink. And immediately, immediately I sat back and I said, there's no chance. I mean, it can be done, but the numbers would be pretty staggering in terms of number of people to be required to accomplish that within like a 5 or 6 hour window. It would be very, very challenging. You would need a mob of people, and it's almost impossible to find 8, 10 people to risk their freedom on any particular night. So I did not trust that at all. And then it came out later, and I'm really surprised this wasn't documented or better publicized. But the insurance company denied the claim based on fraud. They suspected fraud. Now, as far as I know, nobody went to jail for this, which I don't know how the insurance companies declares fraud, but the DAs don't do anything about it. But that appears to be what happened. So the insurance company denied the claim based on fraud, and that was that. And I actually talked to an author once who knew more than he was supposed to know, and he couldn't tell me much, but he said he hinted very strongly he was even more he had access to more than any of us have access to, and he told me this was a case of fraud. And also just to add to that point, I was talking to an attorney friend many years ago, like 10 plus years ago, who told me that one of her interns had dug up some statistic that um I'm gonna botch the numbers here because I just don't remember, but it was like there have been like 80 examples of arson cases where they found ALF or ELF spray painted a scene that later came out was just purely insurance fraud. So and I don't think many of these were ever publicized. So it was just like purely like let's just burn something down, spray paint ALF or ELF, and then to detract suspicion, and then we'll get a big payout.
Before we get too much further into the conversation, there might be some people watching who have never heard of the Animal Liberation Front, the ALF. Um, could you give me like a brief overview on what the ALF is, like, and then maybe a little bit of the history?
Sure. The Animal Liberation Front is a group of underground direct action animal liberationists that have been operated in the United States since at least the 1970s. Basically, anybody, it's not an organization that you can go to their national headquarters and join. There's not a membership card or a secret handshake or anything. It's a matter of getting out there, and anyone who's vegan or vegetarian and goes out and breaks the law in order to help animals that are being exploited, whether that's liberating animals or whether that's inflicting economic sabotage on people who profit from abusing animals. Anybody that goes out there and follows these general guidelines can consider themselves a cell of the Animal Liberation Front. The ALF in particular has a guideline that says they won't harm anybody, animals, non-human animals or human animals. And there's other groups out there that are breaking law to help animals that don't have that caveat, and they call themselves different names. But the Animal Liberation Front is by far the most active of the underground animal liberation organizations. They're active on a not quite daily, but definitely weekly basis around the world, if not here in the United States. There's been some decrease in the amount of underground direct action here in the U.S. in the later years. But that's basically the ALF in a nutshell. The Animal Liberation Front are people who care enough about animals to get off their social media and go out into the world and find out where animals are being abused, whether it's on fur farms, whether it's in laboratories, whether it's on the end of a chain in somebody's yard, where a dog or something is chained up all winter. Anybody that identifies forms of animal abuse and then actually does something about it, physically does something about it, either costs the person a lot of money so they quit doing it, or actually liberates the animals. So that's the ALF in a nutshell.
And Peter, maybe you have something to add to that, but also, I want to ask someone who's was a part of the ALF in the past, like what would bring someone to want to take illegal action for animals? Like what's like the inspiration behind that for, I know you can't speak for everybody, but what would the inspiration be in general?
On a practical level, it just makes sense. If you're out waving a sign day after day, month after month, year after year, eventually you start to do the math and say it's actually be a lot more effective if I just went out and actually just physically rescued animals. So it's really just a practical decision. And so that would be the main motivation is that if you're in this movement to save animals, this would have to be something you would at least consider at some point because it just makes sense to eliminate all the permission-based activism and just simply go to the source and save an animal. So, it can be very difficult to spend years doing activism and never actually have any saved animals to your credit that you can actually say, oh, well, I actually saved this. And it can be very difficult to actually know if you're actually having an impact in the lives of animals. So the ALF that model allows activists to kind of circumvent all the normal channels, go out, rescue animals, or inflict economic damage on their abusers. And so it just makes sense.
I think if you look at it from a larger liberation context as well, every single successful struggle for liberation, whether it was for civil rights, whether it was against the French in Algeria, whether it was against apartheid in South Africa, every single liberation struggle in the history of the world that's been successful has always had an illegal direct action component to it. It's not necessarily the only important component, but like Peter said, if on an individual basis, the most any one individual can do to help animals is to go out there and physically help animals. And I mean, legislation is great, but it takes years and hundreds of thousands of dollars and thousands of man hours. And then sometimes it doesn't even work. And then when it does work, sometimes it gets undone. And so there's lots of reasons to think that as one individual wants to make the most of their animal liberation efforts, go out there and do something at night, and the chances of getting caught are almost nil. I mean, there have been thousands and thousands of these actions that we know of, and many more thousands that we don't know about. There's a handful. I can count the number of people that have gone to prison on both my hands. Pretty much, it's just not very likely that you're going to get caught. You're a lot more likely to get arrested at a protest than you are at doing something really even better for animals.
I wanted to ask Dr. Vlasic, how is the media reporting on this right now? Like maybe a little bit of, how do they generally report on this kind of thing, but also specifically this action that just happened a couple of nights ago. What's been the media response so far?
I've been doing interviews with the mainstream media for 20 years regarding illegal direct action for animals. And I've really been surprised at how well the mainstream media usually embraces stuff like this. They're interested in hearing the other side of the story. So we formed the press office back in 2004 after a liberation of animals from a laboratory at the University of Iowa, where 401 animals were liberated. And the media was hungry for the side of the story besides what they were hearing from the university. And so ever since then, we've done the best we could to try to present the side of the story of those who are willing to risk their lives or risk their freedom to help animals. And in general, it's well received by the mainstream media in most cases. Regarding this particular incident, we've seen the story that I saw just this morning. There were extensive quotes from us, from the press office, talking about why these animals were liberated and how they can survive in the wild, and countering the propaganda that's put out there by people like the Fur Commission USA, whose job it is to stand up for the fur farmer and tell everybody how ethical and what a good person he is. And they provided our viewpoint. It was almost a 50-50 mix, and that we got almost 50% of the say about it, and that would just wouldn't happen if we weren't out there letting people know.
Uh,
It feels like a very, I don't know, Jerry, if you agree with this. I feel like it's a very strategic blunder on the part of the Fur Commission USA, the trade group that represents fur farmers, for them to be publicizing these raids the way they do. And they seem to not, they seem to often be the source of the news. Like we often wouldn't even find out about these. Sometimes we wouldn't find out about these raids. And I don't know what they're thinking. Like the average person, when I tell them, if I just meet someone random outside the movement. I say, "Oh, actually, I went to prison for for raiding mink farms." They always are like, "Oh, I didn't even know those farms existed." Like the average person doesn't even know fur farms exist. So I don't know what the Fur Commission is thinking, making all this noise every time this happens. I think they think that it's going to demonize us, which will somehow help them. But it seems to me just a big strategic blunder.
I agree. I think it's a huge strategic blunder, and I think the only reason they're possibly doing it is because they want to try to get out ahead of us because they've seen how effective we've been in the
Mm.
past about finding out about these things either from communiques or from the local media or the local police department or something, and they've seen how effective we've been. And I think my only guess, and again, I think it's a bad idea, but I think my only guess is that they're just trying to get out in front of us on it and get out there to the media before we do.
um, you mentioned earlier, Dr. Vlasic, about um, sometimes in the media or, people like Fur Commission USA, they'll say that when these animals are released, they're not going to survive. They're not going to make it in the wild. They're going to get run over by a car or, whatever the case may be. I'd like to hear from both of you about this, but Dr. Vlasic, if you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, again, the propaganda that comes out of people like the Fur Commission USA is that these are domesticated animals, that they can't survive on their own in the wild. We know that to be wrong because there have been scientific studies that have either used radio banding or physical observation of captive mink that have been released into the wild, and we know that genetically they're perfectly capable of surviving on their own. I'm not saying that no mink ever got hit by a car ever after being released from a fur farm, but certainly most of these places are out in the middle of nowhere, and there's not exactly a freeway running through them. So they're not very many of them are likely to get run over. They're not going to freeze to death. Okay, they're not going to starve to death. This latest thing by the Fur Commission, their latest press release said that most of the animals will die within 48 hours. Okay, that's just a straight up stupid lie. Okay, nobody believes that. It's definitely not true. It's been shown there are scientific papers that have been written that show that these animals are perfectly capable of surviving on their own. They're not going to freeze to death. They're not going to starve to death, and they're generally not going to get hit by cars. They're going to survive. They disperse over a wide area very quickly, miles and miles very quickly. And so, sure, not every single one is going to survive to live a long life, but 100% of them are going to die sometime this month if they don't leave the fur farm. We know that. So at least they have a chance, and we think that's a good thing. If it was me in that fur farm and I got a chance to survive, I'd take it in a minute.
Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, it's hilarious. First of all, they can't get their story straight. Like the 48-hour thing is new. I mean, I've never heard that until recently. So they're very inconsistent. But one of the things that people don't realize that they're capitalizing on, which is people just not knowing what a fur farm is like. These sheds are outdoors. Like they're not climate controlled. Like these sheds are literally outdoors. So they're not dying due and they always say, "Oh, they're gonna die due to exposure." Like you could even just Google Street View of farm and confirm these sheds are literally outdoors. So we know that's fake. The whole getting hit by cars thing is so dumb. I don't know what animal runs to the middle of the highway and just lays down and calls it a life. It's very strange. So that's ridiculous. And then I don't know if they're suggesting, and no animal can starve within 48 hours. It takes longer than four. So I'm not sure what exactly they're claiming is going to be the cause of death for these animals in the first 48 hours, but it's totally absurd. I actually went to, it's the kind of story I don't even like tell because it just sounds fake, but I actually went to a farm, one of the farms I was convicted of raiding years ago. And again, I have no way of knowing if this, well, I saw mink literally run across the road from the property of where that farm used to be. That farm closed down. I have no way of knowing if that mink was a descendant. It's like, I have no way of knowing, but, mink are, if you just go out into the Midwest and various parts of the country, like you will just see mink running around. So, I don't know how many are descendants of liberated animals, how many aren't. We have no way of knowing that, but it's It's laughable. These animals are native in North America.
Do you know? Do you
I'm sorry, Trey. There's American mink that have been that have gotten out of fur farms in Scandinavia that have actually outcompeted the native mink in that area, and are still living out there today. That scientists have studied, and these are mink that 100% came from fur farms. We know that, and like I said, they're doing better than the mink that were there before.
There was actually a documentary where they took I'm not suggesting anyone do what I'm about to say, by the way, but there was a documentary where they took laboratory rats, white laboratory rats that have been bred in captivity going back like 150 years or something. And they released the laboratory rats. And I think this happened in England. There was a documentary about this. They released them into the wild and tracked their progress. And many of them died for various reasons, but none of them were due to lack of survival skills. And so you've got an animal that's vastly more domesticated than the American mink, who is actually able to reassimilate into the wild. And so there's just no basis for what they say.
do either of you know how often minks reproduce in the wild?
No.
No, I don't know either.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I'm wondering because I mean, I would assume it's a pretty high likelihood that that mink could have been a descendant of one of the minks released from the fur farm, if it's right in that area, you know?
Yeah, if I had to put my money on it, I would say that's probably the case. But mink do live. There are tons of wild mink in Wisconsin. This is in Medford, Wisconsin. And by the way, just going back to my last point, for the people who are new or don't know or want to use this against us later, when animals get liberated from laboratories, those are never released in the wild. There's nobody, the ALF has never taken a rat from a lab and released it into the wild. That would never happen. That's what I was referencing when I said don't do this, because that's not, those animals will always be found homes. Historically, that's always been the case. When you read the communiques, it's always made clear these animals are found homes. But it's interesting to know that if, a rat were to be released in the wild, it would probably have a good chance of surviving.
Yeah, I also just want to throw a disclaimer out there, which is that, Peter has served time for, liberating animals from fur farms. That's how he's able to openly speak about this. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
I'm gonna issue a reverse disclaimer. I have not been convicted for liberating mink, but anybody that wants to get into it, if you go to finalnail.com, there's a list of every fur farm in the United States of America, and I highly encourage you to go and raid them as soon as possible.
Um, Dr. Vlasic, what message do you want the public to take from the recent action? Again, it's not confirmed that it was ALF, but that, we can only surmise. But what message do you think that these activists would want the public to hear?
Yeah, listen, most people in the United States, in fact the entire world, are against the whole idea of wearing fur. If you ask the average person on the street, 95% of them will tell you that fur is stupid. It's a dumb fashion statement, and most of them know that there's a lot of suffering involved. And when you explain to them that 40, 50, or 60 animals goes into making a single fur coat sometimes, and you talk about the immense amount of suffering that goes on, most people would say that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of. They should stop doing that. And I think most people, like Peter mentioned earlier, they don't know about these fur farms. They're in very outback situations. Nobody's driving by them every day on their way to work or anything like that. So they don't know about these fur farms. They don't know that there's somewhere between 50 and 100 of these things left in the United States, where animals are kept in tiny cages for their entire lives and then taken out in November and anally electrocuted or clubbed or gassed or whatever to kill them, and then skinned in order to sell their pelts. So most people are against it. And I think most people, when they realize what happened, if they hear this story, if they see the article in the paper, if they see it on the news, they listen to this podcast, they're going to go, good for them. That's a great thing that happened. And we're really glad that these animals got a shot at life. And, fuck that fur farmer. He didn't have any right to be doing this to animals. And I think the fur industry is on the ropes right now. I mean, it's on the ropes. It's unprofitable to continue raising cage mink, and I think there's a real chance that we can do away with the fur industry here pretty soon, and it would we're down. They're killing less than 1 million animals a year in the United States now, which may sound like a lot, and it is. It's way too many, but it's down from 5 or 6 million just a few years ago, and so the whole industry is on the ropes. And I think that a few more raids like this, again, most of these fur farms are barely operating at a profit, if at all. And many of them will close, and soon there won't be any more, and we can move on to doing something else.
I think it's worth mentioning that right now, more than ever, these farms getting hit, and we kind of touched on this earlier, are very likely to close. So in the past, it was always kind of a, it was always just kind of a wild card. It was like you rate a farm, maybe it closes, maybe it doesn't. At least you save those animals. I would say the chances are, almost a certainty at this point. If a farm gets hit, it's going to close down. These farmers are getting older, the profit margin thing we mentioned, and they just don't stand a chance. So, and what it would take right now, let's just say there are only 50 farms, like what it would take to actually shut down those 50 farms in terms of the number of individuals it would take in this country, not a lot. If you had let's just say you had people right now deciding they're going to find their crew, their cell, so to speak, and they're each going to hit 3 farms. It would take a relatively small number of people, in various parts of the country to just completely wipe out the fur industry this summer. I don't know how realistic that is, but that's how the math works. And so it's pretty encouraging. It's an encouraging time right now. I think Jerry had mentioned off camera that there was some have been recent like physical investigations of farms just to kind of assess like which farms are open, which aren't, and people are finding that a lot of these farms now, the majority of them aren't even full anymore. In other words, there's only a small percentage of cages that actually have animals in them amongst the ones that are even still open. So, and that brings it to a bigger point, which is you hear this, with the Ohio incident we're here to talk about, 2,000 mink release. The average person would say, wow, that sounds like a really huge task to release 2,000 mink. There was a time where we wanted to kind of get this down to a science, and so we timed ourselves, and there was only two of us, and we were able to release 1,000 mink every 15 minutes. And so we wanted to kind of be able to extrapolate that out to the future and figure out, okay, how big of farms could we target and effectively empty them. And so when you consider that, if there were only two people that visited this farm in Ohio, they could have accomplished this in 30 minutes. Not including the time it takes to dismantle the fence and coming and going and all that. But that's pretty incredible what you can accomplish in a short amount of time with very few people.
Yeah, Dr. Vlasic mentioned earlier about, when these sorts of actions are in the media, when there is a raid or a liberation by ALF or another underground group, largely the response from the public is overwhelmingly positive. I always see these comments, say these people are heroes, and even from people who are not generally like animal rights minded, people who are not vegan, they still are vehemently against the fur industry, and think what these animals go through is just so pointless, and pointless suffering. So why is it that the government and sometimes even the media call these people that we would say are heroes, why do they call them terrorists and or eco-terrorists? Peter, if you wanted to start.
I think a lot of it's just public relations. You've got the FBI is very public relation oriented, and it just makes them look like they're solving a bigger problem than they really are. So it's kind of just publicity on their part to say, okay, well, we invented terrorists, these people that carrying out an action that the average person would never consider to be terrorism. So they invented this whole category of crime, or at least are placing activists in this category of a previously existing category, which is terrorism. And now it looks like they're the heroes because they get to solve a terrorism problem without actually, even really defining how, in what way is an activist a terrorist, someone that releases animals from a farm. So I think they love media attention. So there's that. And I've talked about this before, but after 9/11, there was this big push to solve the war on terrorism. And so that's when you started to see, certainly that was not when activists started to become called terrorists, but that's definitely when it took a sharp trend upwards where the media was just in the industries and everyone was calling activists terrorists at that point. And and it's because they're under so much pressure to fight the war on terrorism. Well, if you look around, you're like, all right, well, there's nobody suicide bombing the farmers market this week, and like we don't actually have an actual terrorist to catch, so we have to invent terrorists. And so let's just broaden the scope. That's the easiest thing to do. You just broaden the scope of what you consider terrorism. And suddenly you're winning the war on terrorism. There was a bunch of years where if you looked up a map of the United States, and every once in a while you see this on CNN and stuff would be like terrorism convictions around the nation. And Wisconsin for years just had two, like the number two. It was always just me and my co-defendant. Like we were literally used as to bolster their stats as far as like who was, what states were, quote, winning the war on terrorism. So I think there's a lot of things going on. Fortunately, I think you're seeing that trend the other direction the last number of years, which I think is positive.
Do you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
I think it's all part of the FBI's efforts to maintain funding and get more money for their organization. And to be honest with you, I don't think the FBI is exactly out there mobilizing their forces to try to figure out what's going on here in Massillon, Ohio. I think more than likely they're collectively yawning and wondering like, yeah, what else can we be doing instead? But certainly the Fur Commission USA, they're going to throw the terrorism word around. They're going to try to make people try to look like terrorists. But I mean, think about it. Who's a terrorist? That person that kills 2,000 mink every year by bludgeoning them to death, or somebody who goes in there and gives them a chance at life. I mean, if anybody's a terrorist, it's fur farmers.
I agree with Jerry. I don't think the FBI cares nearly as much as activists seem to think that they care. If you just look, if you really look closely at some of the cases where people have been arrested and you look at what they didn't do to investigate the crime, it's actually very telling. In other words, like how little resources they actually, my case is one, but that's going back a lot of years, so it's almost like not even really relevant to the present day. But if you look at even more recent cases, it's just kind of, and sometimes you have to actually talk to the people involved, and like you just realize like, oh, they didn't do this, they didn't do this, they didn't do this. Like they actually didn't really burn any calories at all to solve this.
Yeah, I can pretty much guarantee you they're not out looking for DNA samples or fingerprints or anything at the Ohio fur farm. They're, I just don't think they have as much interest as people want to make them believe they are.
In my case, they didn't take one tire impression that would have linked. All we would do is just pull onto the farms in the mud, just like straight, just back right up to the fence, and they didn't take one tire, which would have linked us to every farm. I know eventually we got caught for other reasons, but like that would be like where I would start if I was an FBI agent. They didn't even bother to do that.
Peter, would you be willing to like share any stories from your time underground just to maybe help put us in the mindset of, someone who might be willing to risk their freedom for these animals?
Sure. I mean, that's a whole book and a half. I don't even know where to start, but
Maybe just
yeah, there's
one that sticks out.
yeah. I remember. God, I don't even know. I was just thinking earlier today for some weird reason about the time that and there's actually literally countless stories I could tell, but one time we w wanted to target a place that was considered very, very high risk for reasons I don't want to out myself here, but for reasons that were very, it was the kind of thing that was very improbable to pull off, and so we went to we went to the only way we're going to pull off is if we could with technology. And I'm usually on the side of low tech is always best, but I've often been forced to revise that over the years when I realize like you go from like going to a farm where nobody has any radios and you can't communicate, and then you realize, oh, radios are actually a lot better. And so we were in a situation where radios wouldn't even suffice. And I don't know why I'm telling this story, but we went into a Cabela's, like the camping store, and we decided the only way we could pull this off was with night vision goggles because we had very strong reason to believe that this place was going to be staked out by either farmers or law enforcement. And the only way we could confirm that wasn't the case is with night vision goggles. So my friend goes into this Cabela's and he goes to the back counter. And this is not the story you're looking for, but it's the story you're going to get. And he goes to the back counter and he points to this $7,000 pair of Russian imported military grade night vision goggles. And he points to it with complete authority and says, please box it up for me right now, to the woman behind the counter. And she puts it in a box, and you're supposed to pay for it at that point. And he goes, I'm going to pay for this at the front, and just walks right out the door. So we had these $7,000 night vision goggles. And so then we go to this farm that we had every reason to believe again, for reasons that whatever, but every reason to believe was the most surveilled place on earth on that particular night. And we just sat outside in a field across from the farm and just spent like 30 minutes scanning every square inch. And they aren't just night vision goggles. These are binoculars as well. So like you could see rabbits from like 100 yards away. It was insane. And so we're just like, you could see everything. It was just literally like you're in the middle of the day, only if you had binoculars. And so we confirmed there was no one around, and we were only able to pull this off because of we had these night vision goggles. So that's my story.
It's not what I expected, but it
No,
was.
I don't know what you want, but there's a lot. Yeah, there you go.
I'll tell you, just a pro tip talking about technology. These little drones that people can pick up for a few $100 today are super effective at doing surveillance on fur farms and any other targets that people are looking at, because they're so easy to operate, and they can really make a huge difference on doing really quality surveillance in advance of anything that people are planning to do. So something that's I'll throw out there.
I was
I live for the day when you could actually raid a farm with a drone remotely. I'm waiting for that to. I don't know what that's going to take, but that would be like crack for the ALF.
Do either of you know how many operational fur farms are left in the United States or in North America?
Fellow press officer Joseph Budenberg, who has also served time for raiding fur farms, he throws out the number 60. I think it's a few more than that, but I'm almost sure it's under 100. And again, there were 300 of them not very long ago, so I think the numbers are way down. And the ones that we know of, like I said, many of them are just right. There's a few that are like industrial size farms that are probably going to be the last to go, but the vast majority of them are mom and pop operations, and it's not like their children are coming up the ranks anxious to take over the farm. And as these people get older and don't want to do it anymore, I think we're going to see a lot of them go away. So I would say that there's a good chance that the number of fur farms will continue to dwindle over the next few years, especially if pelt prices stay low, especially if we can keep the pressure on retailers and designers like you're doing with Animal Activism Collective and Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade. If we can keep the pressure on the demand side and continue to hit the supply side at the same time, I think this is a winnable struggle.
It's extremely winnable right now. I think it'll be interesting to see historically the reason that the U.S. fur industry has commanded high pelt prices is because of the quality of our pelts, which is heavily defined by the quality of the feed. And so this is just getting kind of like in the weeds of this industry, but like these feed suppliers, they have had these scientifically formulated feed for years and years that the farmers will pull their resources, they'll form these co-ops. There's one in Utah, Northwest, all over the country. They form these cooperatives where they make this scientifically formulated feed that translates to better pelts, which is how we can get such high prices in the world market. And all these co-ops, as far as I know, every single one is closed in the last 5 to 7 years. And so they don't have quality. All these farmers are having to make their feed in-house now, which is going to degrade their pelt quality. So it's just kind of this like negative spiral feedback loop where I don't know if they're going to recover from. Now, if the pelt prices start to swing back upwards, we don't want to get too comfortable. I just think it's and I hate to be the one that, that's like rah rah, but like I'm sitting here in a hotel room, but like I do think this is a great opportunity for activists that are still engaged in these actions to really go for the throat and finish it off.
Dr. Vlasic, you mentioned like some of the pressure campaigns that are going on. Um, could both of you speak to how above ground action and underground action, even though the two are not communicating, like how they can both work kind of together in tandem toward ending the fur
Yeah,
industry?
yeah, absolutely. Pressure campaigns are the second most efficient and ways for an individual to go about making a real difference for animals. And after illegal direct action, the second best thing that one can do is to get involved in a pressure campaign where very specific targets are gone after, and and convinced to leave the animal abuse industry before moving on to the next target. And so those campaigns, like those being run by Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade, are very important. And underground activists, people who are willing to break the law, oftentimes will follow these campaigns. And under ideal situations, they will add their action to a campaign that's already underway from an above ground status. And that's the best of all worlds, to have somebody working above ground, targeting people who abuse animals with, very targeted and specific campaigns, and then having people who are willing to come in and do illegal direct action as an adjunct to that. I think that's the most efficient, the best way to win a campaign right there.
I would encourage everyone to check out Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade and get involved with them as much as possible, any way you can, because they're doing the most effective above ground work right now. So that would be, I mean, if again, and this is going to apply to 99.9% of people watching this. If you don't want to get involved in the illegal side of things, the best way to end the fur industry is to get involved with CAFT. Just look them up and do whatever you can. Get involved like immediately.
Abolishfur.com for CAF to get involved with them. I mentioned it earlier, but finalnail.com for a list of all fur farms in the United States. We're at the Animal Liberation Press Office.org for anybody that wants to follow our work. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I'll mention we didn't, I don't know, it might just be slightly interesting historically, but in the 90s, there was this, I think it was like a not that long, but like we'll say like a 3 or 4 year run where the 4th of July, because we're recording this on the 4th of July, the ALF would have its what they call its Independence Day for animals. And so there was a fur farm raid, maybe it was only 3 years. That was a long 3 years in my life, but there was like, it was like 96, 97, 98. There were these actions that would happen on the 4th of July and they were very cool. I forget what the action was in 96, but in 97 there was a fur farm raided outside Seattle. In 98 there was United Vaccines was raided, a vaccine supplier, and there were mink released from their experimental fur farm outside of Madison, Wisconsin. And so there's a cool little run there where this particular day represented a big win for animals and a night that ALF was always active.
Thanks for bringing that up. I also wanted to mention on the topic of, freedom for all and all that, there are two activists who have been accused of liberating animals from a farm. I believe it was in Pennsylvania. Um, their names are Kara and Celeste, and their trial or their court situation is ongoing. So, for someone like that who's been accused, Peter, how can people support folks that are going through something like that?
The first thing to do is just listen to what they want because that can vary and it may not always make sense to those on the outside. But if some activists don't want support, there's probably a strategic legal reason for that. And that can sometimes vary, it can change from month to month. So just pay attention to what they want. But beyond that, when you have someone sitting in jail, which they're out, but when you have someone sitting in jail, it's really just about letters, um, doing supporting them any way you can to get them vegan food. That's always a big struggle when you're in jail. I was in I think 7 or 8 county jails in one prison. And so I was having to go through this, maybe 8 or 9 times, like, going through the whole process of like trying to fight to get vegan food. And I was only able to do that due to help from the outside. So that was really huge. Letters is huge. And then keeping money on their books. Commissary money. That's just the prison, jail, bank account, so to speak, that allows you to buy food that's not served to you, like food from what they call the commissary. That's really huge. But the biggest way to support, and this is only going to apply to a very small number of people, but the biggest way to support activists in jail or going through a legal case is just to keep your mouth shut. So if if you know something, or even if you don't, even if you're not involved, just not gossiping, not being like, oh, that seems like something they would do, or oh, that reminds me of the time they said this thing it's like just keep your mouth shut, stop talking, don't gossip, and that's the biggest thing you can do.
And remember, they're innocent until proven guilty. In this case, these people have not even been to trial yet or entered a plea. So, as far as we know, they're completely innocent and just happened to be rounded up because they, were convenient. So we don't really know. But yeah, everything Peter said.
I think we're going to wrap up relatively soon. Dr. Vlasic, I'd like to give you an opportunity to just say anything, talk about anything that we didn't cover, or just kind of any final words.
No, it was great being here with you, Trey and Peter. It's some of my favorite people in the world. And just for those that are out there, take Peter's word to heart and make July 4th an event again.
Any final words, Peter?
Yeah, I would love to see the Independence Day for animals resurrected tonight. You guys have a few hours to get some bolt cutters and get your act together and go out. Go to finalnail.com. So yeah, that. And then I would just like to emphasize that while these type of actions might seem very large undertakings from the outside, they're actually very simple. They're actually very low risk. It doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't take really any resources, and it's something within the reach of literally all of us. So, 2,000 mink sounds like a lot. Again, that might be 30 minutes of work. So I just want to leave on that point.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us. You can check out the Animal Liberation Press Office online. I highly recommend Peter's book, Liberate. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us on the channel. Take care, everybody.